Andrew Stephen Damick, an Orthodox Christian priest, mythology nerd, and host or co-host of One Too Many podcasts.
Yeah, The Great Tales, though, is a podcast about myths and legends, both from inside and outside the Christian tradition. And we come to you live on the first and third Thursday of every month to talk about the great stories that Orthodox Christians have been reading and passing on for centuries, sometimes even longer than that.
Last time we gave you the basis for this show by looking at what St. Basil says about reading mythology. So if you haven't watched or listened to that one yet, be sure to check it out. We're going to say that a lot because people are going to keep asking us, why are you talking about these things?
Yeah, how dare you?
But but today on the Great Tales, we're going to start getting into one of those stories themselves, and we will begin, and only begin, our introduction to one of the foundational stories of Western civilization, the first of two long-form narrative poems which gave us the word epic. The Iliad of Homer. Of course, the other is the Odyssey, which we'll introduce in a future episode. Today, we'll be introducing you to some of my favorite people: swift-footed Achilles, horse-breaking Hector, old Priam of the glinting helmet, Diomedes, the master of the war cry, and the aged horseman Nestor.
Yeah, but what exactly is an epic? I mean, it seems like we use that word for anything that we like a little bit. Like that chewing gum was epic. Uh, did Homer really exist? If he did he really write an epic? Why exactly should we care about the biggest tantrum in world literature? And is this all just a story about men who can't control their urges? Well, 60 to 90 minutes won't be enough time to say everything there is to say about the Iliad, but we're going to say some things. And Richard, you just mentioned how much you love the story and its characters. I mean, I don't think they're that likable, honestly, most of them. But, maybe you have a different idea. But anyway, it'd probably be a good idea to just go ahead and begin with our first experiences of the story. When did we first read it? What were our impressions? So go first. You're the big Iliadophile. Is that a word?
Mm. So it's funny you say they're not that likable. I think that one of the how do I say this? Like, one of the purposes of reading and studying the Iliad and should be to learn to love everyone in it. So the Iliad is okay, so let me talk a little bit about my personal history, and then we'll get into this. So I actually read the Odyssey first, but I when I was about, I want to say, 12 years old, I really fell in love with the whole idea of long form narrative poetry. So the Iliad, the Odyssey, Beowulf, obviously, which is probably the story of all stories that's the closest to my heart. The Divine Comedy, which is probably the thing I've taught the most, and then also the Song of Roland and the Lay of the Cid. And that kind of basically was all of my young teenage years, especially for various reasons that I won't get into right now. There was a time in my life where I actually, as a teenager, had to stop reading The Lord of the Rings. And so I know. And so this is a way for me to really get deeply into the kind of mythology and folklore and the things like that Lord of the Rings had given me a taste for.
Hmm.
But then when I was deprived of Tolkien for a while, it was, sort of like, it started out as, oh well, but this Beowulf thing, this feels like Tolkien. Then eventually I figured out, sort of like, there's a reason these things are all, because they're all connected to each other. So I've been reading and rereading the Iliad and the Odyssey for a long time, and they've had a huge, I don't know, probably an incalculable impact on my, the terrain of my imagination, let's say.
Yeah.
And so yeah, very happy. The funny thing is, I was thinking about it, I've done a lot of podcasting now, not as much as you, Father Andrew, not by a long shot, but I've still done a lot of podcasting, and probably hundreds of hours of content out there online with my name on it. And I think I've never done a dedicated discussion about the Iliad. So this is going to be a first ever for me.
Wow. How about that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, okay, as we used to say back on Usenet in the mid 1990s, I have a short, shameful confession to make. And that is regarding the Iliad. So, when I was young, I read a lot of mythology, but I wasn't mostly reading the actual source texts. I was reading
Mm-hmm.
summaries, the kind of stuff that they give you when you're a kid, the kind of stuff they give you in school, right? I was never assigned the Iliad in any class when I was in high school, when I was an undergrad. It was never assigned. Not even I don't think there were even excerpts, to be honest. I mean, mind you, most of that is now over 30 years in the rearview mirror. So there might have been some excerpts, and I just don't remember. But I was certainly never assigned to read this text or the Odyssey or the Aeneid, all things we're going to be talking about. And but I had I was aware of the general outline of the stories because I was reading these sort of summaries, the Edith Hamilton approach to mythology, right? So you've got that
Yeah.
book called Mythology by Edith Hamilton, which is Greek, it's classical mythology. So I was familiar with the basic plots of the stories, and of course I had read a gazillion and one illustrated editions of various kinds of Greek mythology. And yet no one had ever said, here's the Iliad, this, whatever is it, 15,000 word poem, read it. That never came up.
Yeah.
And so, being a young man, but I loved this literature or thought that I did. So I had this admiration for these stories, and a kind of a general outline knowledge of them. But also being a young man, I was not the most hardworking human being in the world at the time. I only learned that virtue later. And so as a result, I had an admiration for these stories, but I wasn't actually reading them, right? In the original texts.
Yeah.
I said short, shameful confession, maybe medium-sized shameful confession. So here's the short, shameful part. The first time that I read the Iliad all the way through was about a year ago.
I mean, so when people tell me things like this, somebody the other day, I was talking to somebody the other day, after liturgy actually, on like the playground at our parish, and they were saying, I can't even remember who it was, but they were telling me this is their very first time reading. Oh, no. This is somebody over, it was over at my house the other day. I remember who it is now. Shout out to Paul out there, the catechumen Paul, who was over at my house the other day, and he was telling me that he started reading Lord of the Rings for the first time. This is as a man in his late 20s, and he was like, "Oh, I'm so ashamed." And for me, I'm like, "No. This is amazing. You get to experience it for the first time." Right? I only vaguely remember what that's like.
Yeah,
I have like a different relationship with it because I've reread it and read it and read it all these different
sure.
times. So, all these people in here,
Yeah,
they're sort of like familiar
yeah.
friends.
Well, and the other thing though is like reading something for the first time as a kid or as a young adult
Yeah.
is not the same as reading it for the first time as someone. I mean, I am now firmly middle-aged. I will turn 50 next year. Okay, that's pretty solidly middle-aged. And so, I mean, it's an interesting question. When I did begin to read it straight through, about a little over a year ago, my thought actually was, "Wow, this is amazing. Why didn't I read this earlier?" But then
Right.
I
Yeah.
also had the thought of, if someone had handed me this earlier, would I have felt the same way about it? Was I ready for it then? And I'm not saying it's just an age thing. It might have just simply been a me thing at that age,
Yeah.
right? Not everybody is the same at 20 as I was at 20 by
Yeah.
any means. So, I had the thought though, which is like, okay, well, knowing now what I know now, if I could go back in time 30 years ago to my 19-year-old self and say, dude, you're going to want to be reading this for the next 30 years. Don't wait 30 years to read this. I would do that. I would go back in time and tell that guy, like, look, man, you're going to want this. You're going to want it. You're going to regret later on that you never got around to it.
Yeah.
So, since I can't do that, if there are any, young people out there listening to this, don't wait. Okay. It's not going to be super easy, especially if you're not used to long poetry. It's not going to be easy, but don't
Right.
wait. But also I want to say to people who are my age or maybe a little younger or maybe a little older, hey, if you haven't read it yet, there's no time like the present. There's no reason to wait. You don't have to just live in regret. You can, there's a whole world of stuff to discover out there, and you might as well go do it. This in particular, like the Iliad, these kinds of texts, is stuff that people have been discovering for centuries.
for
centuries upon
centuries.
centuries, and finding a lot of value there, right? So no matter what age you are, um, if you can read now, mind you, if you're really young, you might need an expurgated version.
So I want to actually say something in defense of reading retellings and excerpts and things like that. When you're
Sure.
young, there's a Rosemary Sutcliffe. I think we mentioned this last time. By the way, two things. One is I mentioned this last time and I couldn't remember the name, and then my wife chimed in the chat. So Rosemary Sutcliffe's the Black Ships Before Troy is
Hmm.
a very good basically kind of it's a retelling in the form of kind of like a young adult novel. That's not really accurate actually. But anyway, it is a retelling that is enjoyable both for young people and adults of not just the events of the Iliad, but the kind of the whole Trojan War cycle up to the Homecomings. And then I think the Homecomings, she has a sequel book that deals with the Odyssey and the other Homecomings. So I think that is a great retelling, and in our homeschooling, that's what we begin with. So we read, so by the time the kids are old enough to read the Iliad and maybe they're teens, they've already read the story of the Trojan War 2 or 3 times and know it pretty well, and
Yeah.
that will make the experience of reading the Iliad more enjoyable. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of names and events, and you're not even totally sure why you should care about any of it.
Yeah.
By the
And
way, the second thing I want to mention about last week's episode, or our last episode, real quick.
oh yeah.
um yeah, we get to do a little retraction, kind of like, the news at the end of, as the credits roll, it's like, here's all of our retractions from the prize thing. So uh there's just a little bit about what a podcast is, because some people may be a little confused. This is a conversation, and we are going to have quotes, and we're going to put those quotes up here. And anytime we put a quote up, I promise you, we'll do our due diligence and we'll make sure like this quote, is where we say it's from.
The real deal.
Sometimes though, in the course of the conversation, I'll say something or you'll say something that will just be like trying to remember something off the top of our head, and
Yeah.
maybe we'll get it a little bit wrong. And
Yeah.
if I ever
As
find
humans
out it's
do.
wrong, right, as humans do, if I ever find out it's wrong, I will be the first to say so, because I love the truth more than I love, my own ego. But I will sometimes get things wrong. And something I got wrong last time, and people got in a huff about this on the internet because they've never heard anyone, not people, but a couple of people got in a huff about this because, look, they said this wrong thing on a podcast. So it's not. I mentioned a quote from Heraclitus that everybody got excited about, this idea that virtue is logos made flesh. Heraclitus did not say that. So the the
Or at
the
least we
whole
don't have any
paragraph.
record of him ever saying it.
We don't have any record. Yeah, that's a better way to say that. The idea actually comes from Euripides, and this is as quoted, as referred to in Donald Kagan's "Who Killed Homer," which, so people want to go out and read the book, and it's located in the book. The way that I remember things when I read is I have like a mental image or a photograph of the page in my head. So I knew instantly where to go look for it in the book, because I remembered, oh, it's in the first third of the book and it's on the right hand page and it's
Yeah.
the second paragraph down, things like that. But because it's been more than a decade since I read that book, I got that page and then a couple of pages later confused. And in one there's a Heraclitus quote, and the other there's this reference to Euripides. And so Donald Kagan talks about how basically this idea of words must become flesh is the whole point of all of Euripides's poems. And that was the quote that I was misremembering. In any case, what we were really talking about last time was Saint Basil, and certainly this is how Saint Basil understands virtue. So in any case, but I just wanted to just mention that. And anytime we misquote something, or you guys catch us in one, please let us know. I am more than happy to correct things, because
Absolutely.
yeah, but we're having a conversation and we will occasionally get some things wrong. So
Right. And I
yeah,
mean, there's no exams, right?
there's no exams. That's right.
No one's being
That's right.
tested on getting right the things that we happen to say in the
That's
podcast.
right.
I should hope not. I mean, maybe someone out there is, but
I will
yes.
say I do teach courses. I do teach courses, and over at Symbolic World Press, and those courses basically have all of my notes, every citation. I provide every single thing for the stuff that I teach. But in a podcast, we're having a conversation about these things. It's a friendly
Yeah.
introduction. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
So I think one of the things, like if I were going to start with talking about the Iliad, when I started reading it, the first thing that I did before I began with line 1, which begins with the word rage.
Hmm.
Uh, in Greek, not every English translation does that, but we'll get to that. Is I went and looked up. Okay, I know that this poem is about the Trojan War. But then you start, and it's like it doesn't say. And one day the Greeks decided to sail to Troy and attack. No,
Right.
no, you are in it, right?
Right.
So like, it seems to have some kind of historical basis,
Hmm.
and it assumes line 1 assumes you know what's been going on.
That's right.
There's no, no chorus steps in and says, and Agamemnon sailed with his ships because they stole his wife. Like none of that is.
You don't get a little like when last we left our heroes ... or
No,
kind of
right.
like, yeah.
It's.
There's
I mean,
there's no rolling. There's no rolling long ago in
yeah.
a
I mean,
Mediterranean far
this is
away.
as they say, the locus classicus.
Yes.
Since we're talking about classical literature, we
Nice,
can go
nice,
ahead and
nice, nice.
throw out some Latin phrases. This is the locus classicus of what is in another Latin phrase called in medias res, which means it starts in the middle of things. And this is the classic example of that. Is
Right.
bam, it starts. And I mean, the war's been going on for years at this point.
Right.
So, I mean, did it happen? Like, is this some kind of history? What is it? And I mean, and who's Homer? Is he real?
Yeah. Who is Homer? Yeah.
Who is this Homer?
All right. So,
And does he have a wife named Marge?
oh my gosh. So last night, I'm gonna credit. Oh boy, my brain is really struggling today. For people who don't know, I got up early this morning to go help serve liturgy, and then immediately came home. And so, like, all I've had today is coffee and the Eucharist, and my brain is, yeah. All
Oh,
right. So,
please
uh,
don't eat on camera if you don't mind.
yes, yes. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. Yeah, yeah. So somebody said something to me last night about, it's a huge shame that this is the greatest poet who ever lived, and they have. Oh, you said this to me. Did you say this to me on the phone yesterday?
Maybe.
My goodness, I cannot remember. I'm so sorry. Whoever
I,
I'm misattributing this to. This is a real conversation I had yesterday.
I
So
mean, we
something
did
like
talk on the phone yesterday, but I
we
don't
did.
remember if I
Anyway,
said
so
this.
somebody said this is like the greatest poet who ever lived, and he gave us this incredible work that, and yet he's still. Oh, oh, this is my buddy John Matthew is certainly listening to this. He's the one that said it.
Okay.
The greatest poet who ever lived, who gave us all of this incredible, these incredible poems, which are still being read and discussed today, the foundation text of Western literature, blah blah blah, and yet he's still only the second most well-known Homer. That's the joke.
It's true. It would
So
be interesting sometime. I don't know. I mean, someone must have done. I mean, The Simpsons has been going on for like, what is it, 30 years now, which is
yeah,
crazy all on
yeah,
its own. I mean, I get the
something
sense.
crazy,
I think it must have
something
jumped the
crazy.
shark back, I don't know, in my 20s. But
It's impossible to know.
yeah, yeah. But in any event, I have to wonder, like, has anyone done like an analysis of The Simpsons and asking why he has this name Homer? Does it mean something?
Yeah,
Probably not, but it would be
probably
an
not.
interesting
Probably not. Yeah.
analysis. But yes,
Okay.
okay. So the real Homer, though,
Yep. The real Homer.
what do we know about him?
Okay.
Is there anything to know about him?
So let's talk about Homer as a person, and then we'll talk about the historical setting for the Trojan War, which I do believe personally, and I'll try to give some evidence here, I do believe is a war that actually happened. Okay,
Okay.
so Homer himself as a person lives. It's a little tricky, but there's philological information. There are certain sounds that used to be in ancient Greek that then fell out a few centuries later, and in particular the diagramma. And if um, a bunch of Homer's lines don't scan unless you include that sound. And then if you include that sound, they scan perfectly.
Hmm.
And so this is one of the things that we can use to basically, kind of date the Iliad. Certainly, it can't be any later than about 700 BC.
And
Most people, yeah,
I was going to say we should say, by the way, for people who aren't used to analyzing poetry, when you
yeah,
say they don't scan,
yeah,
what that means is so when we say a line of poetry scans, that means it fits a particular rhythm and it sort of works rhythmically. But if there's something that doesn't work rhythmically, in a piece of poetry that's supposed to be amazing poetry. I mean, there's a lot of bad poetry that doesn't scan because the
Yeah.
poet is bad.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
But
Right.
but if great poetry, classic poetry doesn't scan, it might be because we're misreading it. Now
Yeah. You're
sometimes the
misreading it, or
poet,
you're missing a sound that
yeah,
like fell out of the
yes,
language or
yeah,
something like that.
yeah. I mean, it doesn't mean, I'm not saying that all ancient poetry is perfect, scans perfectly. It doesn't. But sometimes it doesn't because the poet made it do that for a particular
Right.
purpose.
Right.
But yes, okay.
In this particular case, it's when you include the sound that's, for instance, it's there in Linear B, and then it's there in early ancient Greek, but then later on it falls out. So
Yeah.
if you take that sound and you reintroduce it to the lines that don't scan in Homer, they scan perfectly, right? And so that's the idea. You can actually do the same thing with Beowulf. There's something called Calusa's law, which you can use to basically argue for an early date of the Beowulf poem based on metrical evidence. Anyway,
This is super nerdy, but
yeah, super
hey,
nerdy.
that's
I'm
what you
sorry.
came for.
If you guys only knew how much we're restraining ourselves. All right, so
Especially you.
there's this old rhyme which was it's from ancient Greek, and it was imaginatively translated by Thomas Heywood in 1546 as seven wealthy towns contend for Homer dead, through which the living Homer begged his bread. That is to say, there are seven towns in ancient Greece: Chios, Smyrna, Colophon, Argos, Athens, and one more that I always forget, which basically all claimed that Homer lived in them at one point. But the tradition
Springfield.
about Homer,
The other one is
yeah,
Springfield.
Springfield, yeah. Um, the tradition's going to be like that today, is it? Okay, all right, yeah.
I'm not particularly a Simpsons fan, actually, but
Yeah. Well, I
the
mean,
jokes kind of write
I'm
themselves.
imagining the trolling, the Simpsons references Father Steven would be spamming us with if he were here.
Yeah,
So
don't say his
we
name
can,
3 times. He appears
yeah, I'm
there.
not going
Don't
to.
do that.
He'll
Okay.
appear on the podcast at some point. Yeah. So basically Homer was, according to the tradition, he was a blind beggar. Now, of course, all traveling poets are beggars to a certain extent. They literally sing for their supper, right? But the tradition is that he was a blind beggar, and that he was also the origin, basically the origin of these schools of bards that were a part of, called the rhapsodies, which were part of ancient Greek culture. And that Homer was sort of the founder of them. He's the one that really doesn't invent, but certainly perfects the metrical scheme, which most of them use for epic verse. Homer, for there's a whole lot of evidence that you can put to try to date Homer very broadly between 1000 and 700 BC. Probably more precisely, I would say 850 to 750 would be my personal opinion. Now, for reference, 750 BC is more or less when Isaiah is kicking around and writing his prophecy.
Yeah.
And it is also more or less when this tiny group of outlaws, upstarts, and social outcasts begins to build a city on the shores of a river in Italy called the Tiber. So
Hmm.
that's kind of what's happening right around there. So Homer himself does not belong to the Bronze Age, but he is passing on stories. Certainly, he did not create these stories himself, but he is passing on and probably perfecting an oral storytelling culture which survived something called the Bronze Age collapse. So
Yes.
this is where we get into talking about the historicity of Troy and the Trojan War.
Right. So another question, the classical epic newbie would probably have is like, okay, this is about the Trojan War. Why is it called the Iliad? Like, what does that name have to do with anything? Well, it turns out that Troy has more than one name. Uh,
Yes,
you know,
quite vexingly, everything does. It's a little like going to your parish, and everybody's got two names.
right.
It's actually a strong historical precedent for that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's sort of like the American convert parish, right?
Yeah,
Right.
well, I know.
Which
Yeah, yeah.
which is why I'm very afraid that if you ever get ordained, it's going to be with some name that doesn't doesn't alliterate with
Doesn't
Rohlin.
alliterate nicely. I don't know.
Um,
I mean, yeah,
yeah, but
yeah.
anyway, and we'll even break the trochaic character of your name, frankly. But yes, so Troy is also called Ilion or Ilium. Ilium is the Latin. Ilion is
Hmm.
probably a Greek, and
Hmm.
so therefore the Iliad. It's the the poem or the story about Ilium.
Right, right. And the reason it's called this is because it actually belongs to a whole cycle of poems, which I will talk about in a moment.
Yeah.
Um, but it actually belongs to kind of a whole cycle of poems that are all around the stuff of the Trojan War. But this is the one that is most specifically located at Troy, and
Mm,
therefore, and it's probably also in the ancient world, it was much more important than the Odyssey. Now, modern people, because we're interested in the things that we're interested in, modern people are almost entirely more interested in the Odyssey than they are in the Iliad.
sure.
And typically speaking, even in like classical ed circles, when people write books about them, like 2/3 of the books on Homer will be about the Odyssey, because the Iliad is concerned with a bunch of like aristocratic um like basically discussions of aristocratic values and things like honor and glory, and then lots and lots and lots of descriptions of combat and
Oh,
weapons and
yeah.
armor and
It is
chariots and
it is
horses.
a very very action oriented poem.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like how many different ways can you describe someone getting stabbed with a spear through the neck? Although, as you told me, it actually is the word in Greek
Wh-
supposedly.
well, there's the neck and then there's the breast or the nipple,
Yeah,
right? That's
exactly.
those are the two places you get stabbed with
You get
spears in the Iliad.
exactly,
Yeah.
but there's a whole lot of getting stabbed, and like we're not going to dwell on that. But it's worth noting, like, why would that all be emphasized so much? Well, that's because everybody's wearing armor, and the neck is
Right.
one of the few places,
Right.
that you can actually is a little, it's a soft spot that you can get a spear through.
This is one of my, I mean, honestly, this is why I love the poem so much as a kid. I read these things when I was a kid. I read these things for the fights,
Yeah,
like Beowulf, but Beowulf actually has a surprisingly small amount of fighting that actually
yeah.
happens within the
It's
Beowulf
mostly
poem.
about wrestling, though.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I do love wrestling. But there's wrestling in the Iliad as well, because they don't just, they have like funeral games and contests and wrestling and boxing and all this different
Yes.
stuff. Anyway,
Yeah. Yep.
it's a very action oriented poem. It is concerned with, like I said, sort of aristocratic concerns, things that, anyway, we'll talk more about this, but basically this was the most important poem in the cycle, and we'll talk about the cycle here in a second. But let's talk about Troy for a second. So
Okay.
Troy, or Ilion, is most likely located on the site of the present day village of, I'm probably going to say this wrong because I don't know Turkish, but Hisarlik, in Turkey, on the southwestern corner of the Dardanelles. Famously, it was located by a guy named Heinrich Schliemann, or Schliemann, who is a
Shilmon.
famous archaeologist, probably one of the most famous archaeologists who's ever lived. And it must be said, terrible archaeologist. I mean, he just like so many pioneers in the field, he destroyed so much evidence because he had no idea what he was actually doing when he was trying to dig this
Oh,
stuff up. But
so basically, he was Indiana Jones. I mean,
yeah,
let's
in
let's
the
let's do an
character of
analysis of
Indiana Jones,
Indiana
the
Jones is an
character of Indiana
archaeologist.
Jones, oh, he's terrible. He's
Yeah, he
terrible.
breaks a
Also,
lot of stuff. Like,
breaks a
come
lot of
on,
stuff.
going in there on his own. I
And
mean,
when
you
he
gotta
says
love
like
him, but
uh, when he says like this belongs in a museum, I'm always like, whenever I see like religious objects in museums, I'm like, that belongs in a church. But anyway,
in
um
a
that's so it's so but Indiana Jones is actually based on another early archaeologist who was also just like a terrible archaeologist, but I can't remember
sure,
his name right now. I think he was French though. But
yeah,
anyway, okay, so it was famously located by Schliemann using basically information from the poem and other sources from the ancient world, which people in the modern, early modern world had kind of written off and been like, that never happened. And then he
yeah,
said, what if we took all of these accounts seriously and we read them closely and we started digging? And he dug and he found what he thought at the time was one city. And what we now actually believe is maybe somewhere between 7 to 9 cities.
mm,
And these are normally helpfully labeled Troy 1 through 9. which is also, could be the name of like a film franchise or something. Uh,
Well, I mean,
Troy 1, Troy 2,
reminds
Troy
me that
2,
like
Electric Boogaloo.
in Lithuania, I can't remember the name of the town now, but there's actually a town that there's this version. The town is town 1, and then there's town 2. It's
Right,
literally the same name of the town, but there's 1 and 2. That's actually how it's named.
right. But this happens, you have to understand this happens a lot in the ancient world because a good place to build a city is a good place to build a city, especially when technology is not changing that much over the course of many hundreds or even
Yeah,
thousands of years. A
yeah.
good place for a city just is always going to be a good place for a city. So there are somewhere between 7 and 9 cities there, depending on how you kind of count them, that have been on that site since at least 3500 BC.
Mm.
So pretty long time, no matter how you reckon time. So in particular, Troy 6 and 7, which may actually be the same city, is probably the most likely candidate for the Troy of the Iliad. I will say that debate quietly rages on this point. You can always find people who will put out a different hypothesis, but I think most people think Troy 6 and 7, which were quite large, well fortified, kind of match all the descriptions that you find in the Iliad and in other literature, and then also seem to belong to the correct period.
Okay.
So Trojan culture is most likely Luwian or Hittite, is what most people would know it as, Hittite culture.
So not Greeks, although in
They're
the Iliad they're
very
all speaking
importantly,
Greek.
they are not Greeks. Yeah, very importantly, they are not
Right.
Greeks.
That's kind of the whole
Actually,
deal. Yeah, I mean
actually,
Hittites,
the
right? By the
Greeks
way,
themselves, the Greeks themselves in the poem aren't really Greeks. They're Achaeans,
Achaeans or Argives.
Argives. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah. So they're probably Hittites. So who are the Hittites? You can
Who
Wikipedia this,
are the
but
Hittites?
who are those Hittites anyway? But yeah, they're an Indo-European culture
Right.
in what is now roughly Turkey,
Right.
Asia Minor, right?
Anatolia. I still call it
Anatolia,
Anatolia
yeah,
in my
yeah,
heart.
which just means the
Yeah.
east.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, so they're an ancient Indo-European culture that's in that region. There's no modern equivalent to them. They were basically taken over by Greek culture.
Yep.
So yeah, but they're different. This is one of the key things is that they are one kind of people, and then the Greeks, as we often call them, but they're actually the Achaeans, are another people. But in the poem, of course, they all speak Greek, just like on Star Trek, everyone speaks English.
So right, exactly. Yeah. They all speak Greek, at least in the poem. Now,
Yeah.
obviously, ancient Hittite as its own branch of is actually its own branch of Indo-European. Just for people who want to know,
Yes.
it's its own branch of Indo-European. It's got a lot of funky things about it, but is related to ancient Greek and
Yeah.
uh, ancient Latin and things like that as well. But yeah, so they're related. These Hittites are related in some way to the Hittites in the Bible. Not totally clear how.
Right. We don't know.
Yeah. Again, debate quietly rages.
When you get to stuff that's this old,
Yeah.
there's just not a lot of evidence to go on. So you kind of piece together fragments in a way that has the most
Right.
explanatory power.
Right.
And that's
Yeah.
what you got.
Yep. So the historical basis for the what we're going to call the epic cycle, which is actually not just the Iliad and the Odyssey, it's also 6 other poems which most of you have never heard of before. And I'll talk about those in a moment. But the context for this is probably the Bronze Age collapse. So this is something that happens around the 12th century BC, which is when you had all of these flourishing cultures basically across the entire ancient world. And something happens and they all collapse.
Yeah, we're
And this
not.
includes the Mycenaean civilization, which is basically that's the Greeks, that's the Achaeans that we're dealing with here. It also includes Troy 6 and 7. It also includes a bunch of other stuff.
Yeah, almost everybody but ancient Egypt. Like ancient
Everybody
Egypt
but yeah.
basically survives the Bronze Age collapse relatively intact. It affects them, but yeah. I mean, we could talk about this for hours, but just go look this up. The Bronze Age collapse. It has massive effects on the world, and there are indications, for instance, that the story of the Tower of Babel might be a version of the Bronze Age collapse story.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different stories that come out of the ancient world that all seem to be partaking in this idea of kind of a massive set of cataclysmic events where
Right.
civilization, you know, the world as everybody knows it breaks into pieces, you know.
Yeah. And that seems to be so. I'll talk about this in a moment, but when the Iliad is being composed, let's say, whoever, by Homer or some other poet of the same name, as I once heard somebody say it, people like to argue, did Homer really write the Iliad? The funny thing is that in the ancient world, people did debate about whether or not Homer wrote the Odyssey, but nobody debated about whether or not Homer wrote the Iliad. Right.
Mm.
So anyway, like as I once heard somebody say, the Iliad was either written by Homer or another poet of the same name. So whatever Homer or some other poet of the same name
Some other
was
Homer.
was yeah, some other Homer was writing the Iliad, or was composing it, or was like stitching it all together, or however you want to kind of talk about that. The Bronze Age collapse is a real and, let's say, relatively recent memory. And it's the and I mean, there were ruins, like, people, like, you could go to Sparta and see the ruins of what Sparta had once been. Of course, when we think of Sparta, we think of classical Sparta, but this is not classical Sparta.
Oh
This
no,
is
yeah.
like
These are
Bronze
stories from
Age. Yeah.
centuries before that.
Right.
You know,
Right.
you've got the Bronze Age, and you've got sort of the Axial Age, where there's all this philosophical and religious, you know, development. Classical Age, where it's kind of even more, you know, like. But yeah, yeah, yeah,
Right. Yeah. So all of this stuff is so one of the things that you're getting in the Iliad and in the rest of the epic cycle is this kind of memory of, we know something really traumatic happened to our civilization in your grandfather or your great grandfather's time. So what was that thing that happened? This is kind of the cultural memory of that. But and you can read a lot more about this. There's a kind of an old book now, called The End of the Bronze Age by Robert Drews, which was published in 1938. And if you want to see how the Bronze Age collapse and all the Homeric stuff kind of lines up really well with the archaeological evidence and things like that, it's an old book, but as far as I know, it holds
yeah.
up.
There's
Um,
a newer book about this called 1177 BC, the year
oh, that's a
civilization
great
collapsed
book. Yeah, I was
by
just
Eric
about to.
Klein.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's another one
yeah.
that people can look at.
He's got a couple of really good books, and there's also just like fun videos and stuff out there. So if people want to look into this,
Yeah,
but what I want to just mention, though, is that the Iliad is not important as history. It's useful. It does touch on useful and interesting historical information, but it's not the only reason that it's important, right? So works like the Iliad help us in two ways. The first is that they open a window into the past, and this is where knowing some of that historical context may be important. I really do think there's something to kind of situating yourself within your civilization, within your, the human race. If you like I said, the goal of reading the Iliad should be to read it and actually love everybody in it. If you can do that, then you're going to have some kind of experience of humanity, and you'll be able to see things about yourself, and see things about your neighbor, and to see things about people in your family, and love them anyway, that maybe you wouldn't get otherwise. The other thing, though, is, and this is related to that, is because works like the Iliad contain things that are timeless parts of the human experience. So these are the things which make such stories really important and enduring beyond the context in which they were originally
yeah,
composed.
and to me, that's the most important thing.
Yeah.
You know,
So C.S. Lewis has this great little bit, and this is actually from his introduction to a translation of St. Athanasius the Great's on the Incarnation. But he says, but basically, his argument for why you should read old books. He says, every age has its own outlook. It is specially good at seeing certain truths and specially liable to make certain mistakes. We all, therefore, need the books that will correct the characteristic mistakes of our own period. And that means the old books, obviously, because you can't go to the future and get a book, right? At least I can't. Maybe you've got access to a time machine I don't know about. None of us can
I can't
fully.
tell you that.
Yeah, yeah. None of us can fully escape this blindness, but we shall certainly increase it and weaken our guard against it if we read only modern books. Where they are true, they will give us truths which we half knew already. Where they are false, they will aggravate the error with which we are already dangerously ill. The only palliative is to keep the clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through our minds, and this can only be done by reading old books.
There we go.
So that's kind of what I want to say about, sort of why this is something you should give your time to. We're not going to be doing a how do I say this? We won't be doing this. This is not Iliad 102 or like Homeric Epics 102 or something
No.
today. It's not what we're doing.
This
Yeah.
is a true introduction. Like, hey, have you ever read the Iliad?
Right.
Or
Right.
here's why you
So
should.
what I want to kind of do is give a little backdrop. And then what I would like to do really is to just give a couple of what one author calls like clues to delight, right? So here's some neat stuff which will maybe get you to read this, or if you have read it. I know somebody told me on Twitter, or X as the kids are calling it, but I just really refuse to do that. This week that they'd read the Iliad and just really bounced hard off of it, and they that's totally fine. What I want to do is like give you some things to appreciate about it, which will hopefully kind of help you out. So when people first encounter the Iliad, they are often surprised to learn that this is not actually the full story of the Trojan War. A
Yeah,
friend of mine,
yeah.
the first time he read it, he was like, "Wait, where's the wooden horse?
Right.
Like,
That was my
isn't there a
reaction
big
too a
wooden
year ago.
horse?"
Like, wait a minute. I have been led to believe that there's a big wooden horse, and this
Right.
is the basis for the big wooden rabbit in the Holy Grail.
Which is really the most important thing that the Homeric epics gave us. Really is references to mind for the Holy Grail.
Right. And I
That's
and
right.
I at least thought like, okay, there's no wooden horse. Maybe when I read the Odyssey, that will have the wooden horse in it. Not really.
Also, no.
No,
That wooden
no.
horse is mentioned in a flashback in the Aeneid, but you have to go kind of far to get it. So,
I mean, the Aeneid, that's Homer fanfic. I mean, come on.
well, you have to think of it more of a sort of extended universe.
I know.
So,
I'm just messing with you. I'm just messing with you.
Yeah,
You don't have to
I'm
go off on
pro.
that. We'll do the Aeneid. We'll do the Aeneid at some point.
We will do the
Yes.
Aeneid. There are people who are like, the Aeneid is just, so I'm very pro Virgil. I'm very pro Aeneid. I love, I am the guy that thinks about the Roman Empire every day. So like, I love all that stuff.
Pro
And
Caesar
we will get to it
propaganda.
eventually. Yeah. Well, I mean, listen, we took that thing over. So, okay. So, but let's not
Sorry, I
get
just wanted to
too
throw a
far
couple
afield here.
monkey wrenches into the. But yeah, there's no big wooden horse in there, and you don't even get like what are they fighting about even? What are
Right.
they even fighting about?
Right.
That's not in there. So what are they
Yeah.
fighting about?
Well, it's sort of, I mean, they'll tell you, but it's referenced. Basically, the poem assumes you already know all the background. So
Yeah.
the Iliad is part of something that was called the epic cycle, which was a collection of 8 poems. Now, almost all of them are significantly shorter than the Iliad and the Odyssey. I think that the Iliad is about maybe 16,000-ish lines in ancient Greek, and the Odyssey is right around 12,000, if I'm remembering correctly. So those are pretty long. They're both in 20, divided into 24 divisions called, in English called books. So by comparison, the rest of these are shorter. But basically, together they tell the whole story of the Trojan War and then kind of the aftermath. So it actually
Yeah.
began, and I will just say, only 2 of these, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the only 2 that survive. Everybody in the ancient world
Right.
considered them to be the best of the poems, and
Right.
that's why they survived.
Yeah.
Only about
You can't read the rest, everybody.
yeah,
Which,
yeah,
like,
you can read. People
quel
wrote
dommage.
summaries.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's these might be the best, but wouldn't it be nice to have the other ones? We don't,
Yeah.
unless unless there's some very careful archaeologist out there who finds some papyri or something. If you do, not only will your career be made, but you will also
Right.
be a very, very wealthy person.
Yeah.
You and all of your heirs forever.
Please
and ever.
call me first. That's all I can say.
Yeah, just let us know. We'd be
yeah, just let
interested
us
in
know.
having kind of some
Just
kind
let
of
us know.
deal.
Yeah.
Come on the podcast.
Only about 5% of what was written in the ancient world survives to the present day. Rough estimate,
At
about
best.
5%.
Yeah.
So the Iliad and the Odyssey, the reason that they survived is because they were the best thing. They were copied the most,
Yeah. So they're the
right?
most. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they were the best things, so they're copied the most. So that's why we have them. We have summaries of the other things, so we know what's in them. And sometimes we even have retellings that were written by people who read the original and then they told their own version of it. So we know more or less what's in all of them, but we don't actually have the poems themselves. So the first one was called the Kypria, and this covers the story of the judgment of Paris.
Yeah.
So
This is the event that starts the whole shebang.
right,
You know,
right,
the beautiful golden apple for the fairest, right? Thrown out in the midst of the goddesses,
right.
and they're fighting over who the fairest is, and Paris, he's handed, he said, now you pick who the fairest is, who
So,
gets
so
the golden
Paris is
apple.
a prince of the city of Troy or Ilium. He is
Yes,
the son of King Priam. And
right.
Paris, we're given to understand he is a considerable warrior as any nobleman in this culture needs to be. But we're given to understand that he is kind of
Let's say he is driven by a deeper force.
let's just say that Paris really likes the ladies. Let's
Right.
just say that.
That's what I'm saying.
He's kind of a ladies man. He's kind of he really likes like his beautiful like perfumed love bower and doesn't maybe spend enough time out doing the things that men should be out doing, like
Yes.
raiding and pillaging, for instance. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Except that, yeah, so there's this basically the whole story begins with a wedding. Right? Begins with a wedding, and the wedding itself is quite important. Um, so do you want to talk about it? You want me to talk about this?
I mean, go. Yeah, it's right, because the Trojan War in a lot of ways is about violating
Yeah.
someone's marriage.
Well,
Which
sure. Yes. Yes.
sort of. Yeah, I know.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So the idea is that there's a wedding. The gods are all at a wedding, and and it is in particular it's the wedding of Peleus and Thetis.
Yeah.
So these are Achilles' parents.
Yeah. Peleus is Peleus is mortal.
Yes.
Thetis is a sort of a lesser goddess.
Yeah, she's a river goddess, right?
Yeah. She's not a
And
big deal, but she's a goddess for sure.
Peleus is given to he's given the sea nymph or the sea goddess, the sea nymph Thetis, to marry. And basically he wins her. I think this story is actually in Ovid, but he wins her by basically like grabbing onto her and holding her on. She transforms into all of these different things to try to get away from him, but ultimately like he manages to hang on through it. And the Olympian gods show up to the wedding, and they come to the wedding, and Poseidon brings Peleus two immortal horses who will be two of the three horses of Achilles' chariot later on. So he gives like two divine immortal horses, and Hephaestus gives him the knife. Aphrodite gives him something he's really beloved of Athena gives him a flute. He's really beloved of Athena in particular. So they get all of these divine gifts. And by the way, Thetis mentions in the Iliad that basically it was horrible for her to be married to this human being. Like it was not a happy marriage.
She was marrying way down.
Right. She was
But
marrying down. Like, even a hero like is not the same thing as a god, right? We'll talk about the
yeah,
gods in the Iliad
yeah.
here in a minute.
But like one thing
in
you
any
should definitely
case,
get.
yeah.
I was gonna say one thing you should definitely get out of this, right? So Peleus is Achilles' father, and thus Achilles is often referred to in the poem as
The son.
Peleus or the son of
Pleiades.
Peleus.
Yeah, that's
Sometimes instead of saying Achilles, Homer will just say Peleus.
Right.
That sort of thing. Meaning it poetically fits the line, or just for the purpose of variety. Yeah.
Poets
So
do this
you
kind
got
of stuff
to
all the
know that.
time.
Yeah, you got to know that Peleus is his dad. Otherwise, you're going to miss who Homer's talking about a lot of the time.
It's not just it's not just Achilles that it does this for. Almost everybody in the Iliad has at least a couple of names, and Homer will kind of switch between them based on what serves the purposes of the meter and what serves the purposes of the line, and also because it's fun to just say things a different way.
Yeah, it's not as bad as like a 19th century Russian novel where you really
nothing
never...
is that bad. Yeah. Now I love 19th century Russian literature. I would just say, like, I really do. But
But that's really
it
hard to
is
track who's
it
being
yes.
talked about because there's a
Yes. Is
lot
this
of
Alexander or Sasha or oh wait, no, those are the same person. Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Um yeah, so basically what happens is that the goddess Discord is not invited to the wedding because why would you invite her?
Yeah.
Um, and the problem is that she shows up anyway. And because she's Discord, she shows up and she decides to. So she tosses an apple in, I think Hera and Athena and Aphrodite are kind of standing around there at the wedding. She tosses a golden apple into their midst and she says, "This is for whoever the fairest is." Well, obviously, this is gonna start something. It's like, well, who's between these three goddesses, who's the most beautiful, right? And so eventually, so they decide to have a contest and they appoint a mortal man, Paris, and it's basically because Paris is, like I said, he's a ladies' man, and he's kind of,
An expert.
famously, yeah, famously an expert on the subject of female beauty. But Aphrodite rigs the whole thing and basically says, "Hey, if you'll pick me, then I'll give you the most beautiful woman who's ever lived." This is Helen, who's basically a daughter of Zeus. She hatched from an egg. Long story. And
Yeah, often
I'll give you
referred
the
to
most
as Helen of Troy,
Helen of Troy. Yes,
but
even though
she's
she's
not
actually
really of Troy.
She's actually Helen of Sparta. But anyway,
Yeah.
so basically says, "I'll give you the most beautiful woman in the world as your wife if you'll pick me." So
Pick
anyway,
me.
he picks Aphrodite. Is Aphrodite the original pick me girl? Anyway, so so he picks I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry. Oh my gosh.
I can tell
I'm
this is
I'm
going to be a longer episode than we were intending.
Oh boy, we're not really making a lot of progress. All right. So he
It's
picks
okay.
Aphrodite and and then Paris goes and he basically, with Aphrodite's help, steals Helen away. Helen is married to a guy named Menelaus, who's the king of Sparta, and basically steals Helen away, takes her back to Troy, and that begins the war.
Yep.
And
Yep.
the Trojan War lasts basically 20 years. And there is probably uh like a historical reality in which there was like a series of wars or kind of basically like a long war of attrition between two kind of coastal like seagoing empires there in that part of the Aegean Sea.
Right. And you could reasonably ask, like, if this was a historical war, which I think
Mhm.
both Richard and I are coming down on the side of, yes,
Yeah,
it
I think
was.
I think yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Was it really all fought because one guy stole another guy's wife? Um, in the story, that is the way that it works.
Right.
Um, so that's the important thing in the
Right.
story.
Right.
Um, if you're going to try to say, okay, what's the history here? Probably not. That's hard to believe. But then again, ancient people had different standards and different
Right.
values, than
Right.
we do.
Because
Um,
this isn't just about a man whose wife is taken away from him. This is like a serious offense on basically
oh,
every single
sure.
kind
I
of
mean,
level in an aristocratic society.
yeah, within the story, like
Yeah.
everyone wants Helen, and they all agree, like whoever gets her, we're all going to defend her,
Right.
and the guy that she marries.
Right.
So there's
Right.
this sort of pact that they all have. So there's
Right.
honor involved, like big
So
honor.
in the Kypria, we get the judgment of Paris, the abduction of Helen, and then basically Menelaus' older brother Agamemnon, who's like basically you could say like the high king, for lack of a better term. He's the high king of the Achaeans. He goes around and they basically get everybody to sign on. It's basically all of Helen's former suitors, by the way. They get all except for obviously Achilles, who was not born at the time of the. Well, anyway, we'll come to that.
Yeah.
Is all of Helen's former suitors. By the way, this is one of the things that did not go unnoticed in the ancient world, and which I will explain in a moment, is that Achilles seems to be too young to be fighting in the Trojan War if everything kicks off when his parents get married. There is an explanation for this. It is wild, and I will get to it in a minute.
Oh,
So basically, Agamemnon gets all of basically all the former suitors had taken an oath that no matter who Helen chooses, they would basically defend that guy. So they have to
yeah.
go around and recruit all of these guys, and Odysseus helps them out. And anyway, long story short, they marshal the Achaeans. Agamemnon has to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia, which will cause lots of problems for him later. I
Oh,
will not
indeed.
talk about that today, but
Yes.
the ancient Greeks actually really disliked human sacrifice, and they believed that if you did it, it was the sort of thing that would have bad consequences for you later. But in any case, it's so the Kypria in 11 short books basically covers all of this stuff and the course of the Trojan War down to the quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles, which begins the Iliad.
Yeah.
So the Iliad is 24 books, and it basically happens over the course of a couple of weeks in the middle of the Trojan War, basically like 10 years into it. This is the wrath of Achilles, its consequences down to the death and the funeral of Hector.
Yeah.
And then
And
this would have been followed. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, and here's the basic reason why this is the opening conflict of the Iliad is that as they're winning at various points, as the Achaeans are winning, they're taking booty, which includes women, you know? And so there's a particular girl that Achilles has his eye set on,
Yep.
and he gets her, but Agamemnon decides, no,
Was it?
I will take her
No, no.
because
What it
he
is?
got.
What it is
I may be
is
misremembering this.
well, it's okay. It's just a little more. So basically, what happens is that Agamemnon takes this woman named Chryses,
Yeah,
who is which means like the golden one, right?
right, right.
Um,
Feces.
that Agamemnon, this woman that Agamemnon has basically taken as a concubine as part of the process of looting. They've just attacked and looted this. Basically, they don't go straight for Troy. The Achaeans raid all of these other parts that are part of like the Trojan trading empire.
Yeah,
One of
yeah,
those
yeah.
places is a place that's sacred to Apollo. Apollo's on the side of the Trojans in the war, and there's a priest of Apollo named Chrysis, who has a daughter Chryses, and basically Agamemnon takes his daughter as a concubine, as a slave, as part of all of this. And so the priest shows up and asks him with a bunch of treasure and asks Agamemnon to return his daughter. And Agamemnon refuses, and then the priest prays to Apollo, who is the god of healing, but also the god of plagues.
Disease. Yeah, and so Apollo shoots his
Yes,
arrows because he's a plague god.
yeah, he's a plague god. And basically, this disease, and actually, this is one of those things I'm going to say, and I'm not going to provide the citation right now. So you guys, just
Just throw it out there.
probably a lot of people in the ancient world basically connected him to Beelzebub, who was both a healing
Oh,
god and a plague god in
well,
ancient Semitic
and
culture. So
also
anyway,
Rephish,
yes, that's
who's
right.
mentioned in the Psalms, another
That's right.
plague arrow guy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Anyway, so this plague breaks out and it's just wasting. And of course, you have to think like probably a large armies camped outside of cities in a state of siege often are visited by large plagues, right? So this is again probably
Many such
a
cases.
historical detail for us. Yeah, many such cases. And so the Greeks realize that they've angered Apollo and they got to return this guy's daughter. And basically, everybody gangs up on Agamemnon, who's the High King, to make him do it. And he says, and it's really Achilles who bullied them into it. And
Oh,
then
that's
he
right.
says,
That's right.
he
That's right.
says,
Now I'm remembering. Now I'm
okay,
remembering.
well, if you're going to take this concubine away from me, then I'm going to take your concubine away from you.
Yeah,
And
Briseis, isn't that her name?
Briseis, yeah.
That's what it is.
And
Yes,
this
yes.
this is what causes. I don't know why you don't like these people, Father Andrew. Anyway, this is what causes the titular rage of
The
Achilles.
rage.
I guess it's
Yeah,
not titular, but anyway,
Achilles is
this is
mad because the girl that he
right,
took was taken from him to
right.
make up for the fact that Agamemnon lost the priest's daughter.
But it's not really about the girl. It's about his kleos, his
Yes, yes.
glory, which
He's
we'll
been
talk about in a moment.
he's been
Um,
dishonored, but
right.
I mean, it's not about the girl, you
Right.
know.
Yes. It's not about the girl, but it's also not so much about the girl. In fact, Agamemnon later trying to get Achilles back in his good side offers Achilles like a bunch of girls, and Achilles is like, "What is all like? What good is this to me? I'm going to die soon anyway." Very important detail is that
Yes.
Achilles gets a choice, and we'll talk about this later in the episode. But
Yes.
Achilles
Right.
gets a choice early on in his life between kleos and nostos, between glory and a homecoming and a comfortable life. And is
Right.
basically you can have more glory than any human who's ever lived, or you can die from old age, but you cannot have both.
Right. And
And
he and he
and
he goes for glory.
he goes for glory. And when we read the Odyssey, we will see how that went for him.
Yeah, how
But
that
uh,
turned out.
but but I have to actually try to make some forward progress here. All right, so the next book
Okay.
after the Iliad is the Aethiopius, which is only 5 books long, but it basically takes us from Hector's funeral, which is how the Iliad ends. By the Hector, we will not even have time to talk about Hector today, but Hector is he's the main Trojan hero. He's kind of awesome, and he's really Achilles' mirror image.
I
Everybody
will
likes
say,
Hector better.
as I say, I will say, if there's anyone that I actually like
Yeah,
in the Iliad,
yeah.
Hector. I mean, I don't super love him, but he's definitely the best, probably, of
I
all
mean,
the people.
I deeply love Hector. Shakespeare, when he was doing his retelling of this, he has he likes Hector so much. He's not, and basically, if you're sort of like from the Latin lineage of the stories, the Trojans are the good guys. There's no
Yeah.
good guys or bad guys in the Iliad, which is an
No.
important point that I'll talk about later. But um, but
Yeah.
but basically, Aeneas goes from the ruin of Troy. He's a Trojan who goes from the ruin of Troy to found Rome, and then basically also like Brutus founds Britain and things like that. And so the British, like the English, saw themselves as being kind of like linked to Troy in a certain way. So when
Yes.
Shakespeare's doing his retelling based on using the sources that he's using, he basically makes it so Achilles can't beat Hector unless Athena basically tricks him. So anyway, it's a kind of an interesting retelling. So the Aethiopius goes from Hector's funeral to the death of Achilles, um, and then that's followed by a book called the Little Iliad. So there's the Iliad and the Little Iliad. The Little Iliad is uh, which is written by Bart rather than by Homer. Is I'm sorry. It describes the contest. We both got up early and had to go to liturgy this morning, and I just feel like that's bringing a certain energy to this episode. But anyway,
Yeah.
okay, so it describes the contest of the arms of Achilles. So that may not sound like a super interesting things to you, but it was a hugely important part of the story in the ancient world. It's referred to in the Odyssey. Um, and then this is also where the wooden horse is actually constructed, and where
Yeah.
Odysseus comes up, like wins the contest for the weapons, and then is also credited with the wooden horse. And then there's the sack of Troy, or
Writ-
which
Written
is
by
2 books
Sideshow
long.
Bob.
Yeah, written by Sideshow Bob. Yeah, actually written by a guy named Artinos, who also wrote the Aethiopius.
Okay.
And then that's followed by the Nostoi, or the returns, or the homecomings,
Yeah.
which basically describes the post-war fate of Diomedes, who gets off quite well. Nestor also gets off quite well. Neoptolemus also gets off quite well, and Menelaus, who also gets off quite well. Unlike Agamemnon, who does not have a happy ending to his story.
Don't. If you're going to walk away with one moral to all of these
Yeah,
epics
no
is
human sacrifice.
don't sacrifice your daughter.
Yeah, don't do that. As the last of the homecoming stories, we get the Odyssey, which is obviously much longer than the Nostoi. It is about Odysseus's homecoming with a few detours along the way. And then finally the Telegonia, which is continuing the story of Odysseus's adventures until his death at the hands of his son, who he doesn't know is his son until and then his son marries Penelope. It's all a little weird. It's his son. It's his son by Circe, who then kills
Yeah.
Odysseus accidentally and then marries Penelope, and everybody lives happily ever after. Oh, and then Odysseus' other son marries Circe just to make it extra weird. Okay. Anyway,
That's
um,
weirder than Hamlet.
it's so strange. But that's the sort of the end. So that's the epic cycle. It's 8 books long. Um, the Iliad is the story. My gosh, we're not making a lot of progress here. The Iliad is the story of the Rage of Achilles, right? The story
Yeah.
of, let's say, the greatest tantrum ever thrown. And basically,
Yeah.
what it is that Achilles, because his kleos has been stripped from him, basically Achilles says, it's me and the Myrmidons, who are his men, who are doing all of the work in battle, and we're getting the worst share of the loot. And now you've taken this girl from me. And Achilles says, I've had enough. I'm going to sulk. And then he prays to his mother and says, could you please go ask Zeus, because Zeus owes Thetis one. Again, this requires a lot of Yeah, lot of background, but Zeus owes Thetis kind of big time. So Thetis goes and asks Zeus and says, "Could you basically make the Achaeans lose until they apologize and feel really sorry about what they've done?" And so Zeus turns the scales of victory against the Achaeans, and the Trojans start winning the war, which they have not been up to this point, because the Achaeans have all the best heroes on their side. But the Trojans start winning the war. Hector starts killing people, and then what happens is that Achilles' tantrum gets away from him, and it ultimately results in the death of his best friend. And
Yeah.
then Achilles gets some sweet new armor. He goes totally berserk. He kills a bunch of dudes and almost loses his humanity in the process, as we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yep.
this is the story of the Rage of Achilles. It's about the ways in which the powerful Achilles feels powerless, how the Lord of Men Agamemnon has no control over his own men, and how everyone's individual choices are caught up in a web of fate and the gods. So this brings us to the famous opening line of one of the foundational texts of Western civilization.
Yeah. Okay. So now here we are, 70 minutes into this episode,
Yep,
and
doing
we're,
great,
we're
doing
about
great.
to hit the very beginning, first lines. But we're not going to read the whole poem today. Yeah.
That's right.
So
It's just be us reading the
it's
Iliad
just
for
an
the next 18
introduction.
hours.
It's just
Yeah. I
buckle
will
up,
say though,
everybody.
I will say though, this is the best way to do either of the Homeric epics would be to get together with a group of people around some food and a fire and maybe some wine
Mm,
and go straight through.
mm.
If you ever have the opportunity to do this, this is the best way to do them, and you will
Yeah.
understand things about them that you won't understand any other
Yeah.
way.
I mean, like the way that people would hear these, like they would get together. It would be like a
Yeah,
big get together. There'd be food and drink, and then one a poet would
yeah.
begin singing this thing, and
And
you would
there's
get
there's
it
certain
live.
there's certainly evidence that they were used in a kind of like semi-liturgical way in Athens, for instance,
Yeah.
in the classical period and
Yeah.
things like that. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
we'll talk more about that in a minute,
Yeah.
but
Okay.
go
So,
ahead and introduce our next clip.
yeah. Yeah. Okay. So before we start to read some of these lines from the Iliad, I I want you to hear it in. I'm going to use the word original, very, very advisedly, but the original Homeric Greek text, right?
It's not the original
So
Klingon.
that's right. And so I got a friend of mine, John Michael Boyer, who is a renowned Byzantine chanter and composer and member of Capella Romana, right?
And a deacon?
No, he's
No,
he's
not a
a
deacon.
he's a
Okay.
layman. No,
Okay.
he's
All
not a
right.
deacon. Yeah, and he was also in Mr. Holland's Opus. Actually, I
Ooh.
like to talk to him about that whenever I can. Yeah, he was in that film. But yeah, I got him to record for us the first 7 lines of the Iliad, and he did it in 2 different pronunciation styles just to make it super nerdy. So the first style, and I'm going to play this for everybody. The first style is what's called Erasmian pronunciation, which is a Renaissance era theoretical reconstruction of ancient Greek pronunciation. So I'm going to go ahead and play this for you so you can just hear the first 7 lines.
Menin aide tea Peleiade o Achilleos ulomenin, Hemyri Achaios alge έθηκε, πολλάς διφθήμους ψυχάς αίδη προίαψεν χερών, αητούς δε χελώρια τέχε κύνεσιν οιονόησιτε πάση, Διός δε τελέιο το πουλέ, εξχού δε τα πρώτα διαστέτην ερίσαντε ατρεΐδες τε άναξ ανδρών και Διός Achilleus.
Okay, so I mean, what a great voice that guy just has to read. You should
So
hear him
good.
sing if you haven't.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now, okay, now we're going to hear John read it as a modern Greek person would read it, right? So this might seem weird, to have him do it this way, but it is actually the case that ancient Greek texts in Greek society simply have always been pronounced with whatever the current pronunciation in Greek has been,
That's right.
right? They weren't trying to recreate some earlier pronunciation; they just kept reading it. And this shows the continuity that we talked about on the show before, that these texts were never lost and rediscovered. For this, one of the major cultures of the Orthodox Church, Greek culture, right? They just kept being read. So here's that same clip with modern pronunciation.
Μήνυν αίδε θεά Πηλιάδε ο Αχιλίος ουλωμένην, ήμυρη Αχαιής άλγε έθηκε, πολλάς διφθήμους ψυχάς άιδη προίαψεν ηρών, αυτούς δε ελόρια τεύχε κίνεσιν ιονίσιτε πάση, Διός δε τελείε το βουλή, εξούδη τα πρώτα διαστή την ερίσαντε ατρεΐδιστε, άναξ ανδρών και Δίος Αχιλλεύς.
Okay, so probably to a lot of people that sounded the same. But just for instance, the last word, right? In the Erasmian pronunciation, he pronounced it Achilleos, whereas it's Achillefs in modern Greek.
Right.
As just one point to mention, right? So yeah, that's the first 7 lines, and that's how it's been being read by Greek people for 2,800 years now, right? So, all right, now I'm going to read to you from the Robert Fagel's English translation, which was published in 1990. And we recommend this translation a lot, actually. This is a good, solid. There are many, many to choose from, but
Fitzgerald is also pretty great. But I think Fagel's is one of the. I just like it a lot. There are a lot of reasons basically the translation theory that Fagel subscribes to is the one that I also subscribe to, which I will not go into right now, but I just like it. I think it's good.
Yeah. And one of the things I like about this is that he begins the poem with the same word that it begins in Greek.
Yeah.
Right? Which I think is really important. And this is how it begins. Rage. Goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls, great fighters' souls, but made their bodies carrion, feasts for the dogs and birds, and the will of Zeus was moving towards its end. Begin, muse, when the two first broke and clashed, Agamemnon, lord of men, and brilliant Achilles. I mean, that is epic.
Come on, that is in fact epic. I mean,
that is epic.
Again, how can you not love this? I mean, it's you actually get so many great bits of data in here, right? Like all these sort of important things, like what kind of a story is this? Who's it about? Right?
Yeah.
It's about war, it's about men, it's about heroes, it's about, you know, it's a story. I mean, that's the thing to say about the Iliad to begin with, is that it is a story of heroes.
Yeah.
And the thing that people will misunderstand or not be prepared for when they read not just the Iliad but other kinds of ancient literature as well, is that to be a hero means something different for this culture than it means for us.
Oh,
right?
sure.
So,
right. We think of heroes as this is the good guy who accomplishes the great things and sacrifices himself.
Superman,
whatever.
And,
yeah. But no, that is not what hero means in the ancient world. Hero in the ancient world is this is someone who moves the world because he's so powerful.
Right. And and in the Odyssey and the Iliad, so only one time in the Odyssey is Odysseus actually called a hero, which is funny because it's his own poem. That is because for most of the poem, Odysseus is not functioning as a hero.
Mm.
In the Iliad, the word hero is used again and again to describe both the Achaean attackers and the Trojan defenders, although, again, very importantly, the Achaeans have more heroes and bigger gods on their side, basically, is what it comes down to. So in the Iliad, a hero means a nobleman, and more specifically, it means a warrior with acknowledged victories, somebody who's really good at murdering other human beings, somebody who gathers spoils.
Yeah.
Right.
It's like champion, maybe. Champion might be a better in the martial sense, right? Not the sports.
But hero is the actual word in Greek, and that's why
that's right.
Worth emphasizing here. Right.
Yeah. Pagan heroism. This is what it is.
Right. Yeah. So if that sounds like a little scary to you, you're welcome. Christianity has changed a lot of things in your world. So you're welcome.
Amen and share.
Yeah, that's right. Amen and share. So Achilles' wrath comes about because he has been stripped of his kleos, of his honor. Right. And so we'll talk more about Achilles' choice in a moment, but let's say that temporal glory is all that is available to him here.
Yeah.
Right.
Like he's been made to look like a fool in front of everybody.
Right. That's
like a
the thing.
loser, like a
And so
loser.
to have that, which is basically his heroism, has been stripped away from. By the way, hero worship, an actual thing in the ancient world. You would have your
Yes,
heroes would die, and then they would put it wherever they died or the city that they founded. They would put a shrine up,
that's right. They
to
would
this person.
sacrifice to them, pour out sacrificial blood to
Right.
them. Yeah.
Right.
Oh
And
yeah.
basically, they'd be worshipped as like a sort of a lower tier deity. Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So he's had his heroism actually stripped away from him, and this has filled him then with this insatiable loss, this knowledge that the only consolation which is granted to him in this world is no longer available to him. And this is what I really want to emphasize. It is not that just that Achilles has lost a prize. As he points out, what does he care about women? He's going to die soon anyway. This is one of the things that Achilles knows,
Yeah.
is that if he pursues glory, that he'll die almost immediately after Hector. And this is one of the things that has to be on his mind when he finally pursues Hector and they meet on the battlefield. He knows he's going to be given victory over Hector, but he also knows that after he beats Hector, he's going to die. Right? Somebody else is going to kill him. And you've probably, but I should just mention, by the way, this the whole like legend about Achilles' heel and stuff comes much later on. Nobody's heard of that at the time
Yeah.
of the Iliad. So the Iliad is not like Achilles' his only vulnerable spot is in his heel or something like that. Now he is killed by an arrow to the foot, shot by Paris, the guy who's started all these problems.
That guy.
Um,
I
and
don't like him.
probably, as I will, actually, let me say this. Let me say this for just like 5 minutes from now. I promise I'm going to try to pay all these things off. Um, but basically, Achilles knows he's going to die, and so the only thing that he gets in life. Remember, it cannot be emphasized enough that the Christian virtue of hope. Right. So when like the church fathers, they make list of the virtues. There are the three in the West. They were called the three theological virtues, which are faith, hope, and love. Well, okay,
Mm.
that's not a Latin list, that's St. Paul's list, right? But the way that the church fathers expanded on the virtue of hope is that the Christian virtue of hope is in particular the hope in the life of the age to come.
That's right.
It
That's
is
right.
the
I mean,
hope of the resurrection.
all a pagan can really hope for.
Right.
And this brings us back to Indiana Jones. Fortune and glory, Dr. Jones.
Fortune
and glory.
That's right. That's nice.
I did not walk into this episode expecting to quote.
I feel like we're doing like a
Jones.
decent amount of pop culture here. I feel like Father Stephen. I'm not going to name him
Don't
again. But
say his name 3 times.
I feel like he'd be pleased. So this is all that he has, right? And so he's been belittled in this public way that's forever going to be associated with his name and with his story. And if we don't understand this, then we're not going to be able to understand how Achilles was thought of in the ancient world. Because Achilles was understood by everyone, such as, for instance, Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar, two very famous, highly successful, generals, conquerors. Some would say mass murderers, but that's just Gaulish propaganda. This he's understood by everyone who came after as having been the ideal of the pre-Christian man.
Yeah.
So if you can sort of put yourself in the frame of ancient man before the coming of the light of the gospel, we know that we're meant for glory and honor, but that something has happened to strip all of this away from us.
Yeah.
And it's too easy to read the result of that dishonor in the history of our race: rage, paralyzing anger, apathy, and ultimately the destruction of the people we hold the most dear. And so sort of stuck in that strange in-between place where glory, which is unobtainable, right? And so you've asked the gods to destroy your allies so that your glory will be exalted, but then you're not yet willing to go out and do something about it. But also, so glory is like unobtainable, but it's also the only thing worth having. Achilles, for instance, sends his dear friend Patroclus to go out and impersonate him, in his armor, resulting in him getting killed by Hector, right? Who then, by the way, very important, takes Achilles' armor and wears it himself.
Yeah, so there's all these kinds of issues of like, who is the real Achilles?
Who's the real Achilles? Because the final climax, the final battle of the poem is between Achilles and Hector, and they're both wearing, like, Achilles has new armor, so they both look like Achilles, and it's this face down, right, really between
Yeah,
Achilles and himself,
that's right. And
right,
and
and
and over the body of like there's they're fighting over the body
yeah,
of
yeah,
Patroclus
yeah.
at one point. Like it's really
There are a lot
interesting
of
how much of
fights
the
over
poem turn.
bodies and fights over armor.
Yeah, how much
Yeah.
there's fights over bodies and armor in this thing. Which, like, if you want to read that in an allegorical way, what is your body? What is your armor?
Right.
Who are you? What is your face?
Right.
You're fighting over who you are,
So this
right?
is the interesting thing, is that the story of Achilles is of someone losing and then reacquiring or finding again his humanity. So Achilles will lose more and more all of the things that make him human until he finally becomes this monster who literally gets into a fight with a river. I
Yes,
mean,
that's right.
it's like the
It's one
worst
of the best
D&D
scenes.
it's
One
like
of
the
the best
worst
scenes
D&D
in the
player
poem.
of all time. Like, I attack the river. Sorry, you do what now? No, I'm gonna attack the river. Fine,
Well,
I
the
guess roll for that. I don't
yeah,
know.
exactly. You roll a 1.
Yeah.
Actually, he
Uh,
kind of
um,
rolls a 20.
yeah, I mean, well, it's really the other gods gang up on the river. In any
Yeah.
case,
Well, that
but
I mean,
I will say,
let's
like,
say that answers the question though of who the bad guys are. It's pretty clear it's the
well,
gods.
yeah, we're gonna talk about this in a
Okay.
second. Yeah, yeah, because basically the blend. Let's say that agency is very uncertain in Homer. Like, it's like, wait, did Homer kill Patroclus, or was it actually Apollo through Homer? Sorry, did Hector kill Patroclus, or was that actually Apollo through Hector? Like, what's going on here? And even at some point it says, well, Athena killed Hector through Achilles. So, like, who really killed Hector as well? But so as Achilles is in his, Aristeia, he's in his battle glory, and he's going totally berserk, and he's like the gods, or like a wild beast, or even like a woman, but he's not like a man. I'll explain the woman thing in a moment. Like, he's gone completely berserk, and then he finally confronts Hector there at the gates of the city. And Hector says, before they fight, he says, Achilles, I'm paraphrasing here, let's make a pact. And the pact is that whoever wins, we're going to honor the other man's corpse. Because, like, so early on in the poem, the very first thing that happens after the first day's battle is that everybody agrees to, like, take a day off of fighting so everyone can go out and bury their dead. This is
Yeah.
a very important mark of civilization. It's the thing that if you don't do, you're not fighting a civilized war. Like, if you don't
Yeah.
give the enemy time to collect and bury their dead. Okay. Um, and so, like, actually the some of the forms of total war in the modern era are much more barbaric than anything
Absolutely.
that happened in the ancient world or the Middle
Absolutely.
Ages. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So he comes so the Hector says, let's make an agreement, let's honor each other. I'm the greatest Trojan hero, you're the greatest Argive hero, and so between the two of, let's just agree, whoever wins, we're going to treat the other person's body with respect. And Achilles says, he says, men don't parlay, men don't bargain with lions. Now the question is, which thing does Achilles think he is in that moment? Is he a man, or
Yeah.
is he a lion?
Is he the
Well, we
lion?
find out a moment later that after Achilles, basically as Hector is dying, because there was a little chink in his armor in the neck, and Achilles, managed to spear him through it. So as he's laying dying, but it says, his arteries basically, spurting blood, but his voice box isn't cut. I mean, Homer. I mean, people in the ancient world probably saw a lot more warfare than most of us have seen, and the
Yeah.
descriptions are very, let's say, anatomically precise.
Very graphic.
And so Hector, as he's dying, he says something, and then Achilles basically says, I wish I could just cut you up and eat you raw. That's what Achilles says to him. The only other person in the book who talks like this is Hecuba, who said, Hector's wife, or mother, who says it during her rage and impotent rage and grief at the death of her son. So the only two people who talk in this way are both people who have, like, had something so traumatic happen to them that their relationship with their humanity has been ruptured. And basically what Achilles does is he takes Hector's body and he drags it behind his chariot for days and days and days after the battle, right? And eventually the gods start to threaten to to destroy Achilles and the entire Achaean army over this. Why? Because funeral rites are one of the important things in the ancient world that connects you to the gods and with your fellow human beings. And Achilles has ceased to be a human being.
Yeah.
And so the gods have to basically force him and get his mother to come and kind of intercede with him to allow Hector's body to be buried, ransomed and buried by King Priam.
Yeah.
And that is the thing that restores Achilles back to human fellowship at the end of the poem.
Yeah. And the gods, of course, are, while he's dragging Hector's body around, the gods are like monkeying with it to keep it preserved, so it's not.
Yeah, Apollo
corrupted.
makes it so it won't be corrupt and all that stuff. The gods monkey with a lot of things in the poem. We'll talk about that next. But I just say all of this to say that one of the ways that ancient Christians, like for instance in Syrian literature from the 3rd and 4th century even, so one of the ways that Christians have understood the Iliad is essentially as a pagan retelling of the fall of man. So you'll find this, for instance, in some of the pseudo-Clementine homilies, which I don't necessarily recommend people go out and read. It is something that literature that was kind of preserved in our tradition. There, you can get some weird ideas if you coming away from some of it.
There's some fun stuff in there.
There's some fun stuff in there. But I point this out to mention that early Christian writers strongly identified Achilles with Adam and saw Achilles as a type of Adam. And in fact, this brings us to the curious question of Achilles' age at the time of the Iliad.
Oh, yes.
So there's an etymology. It might be kind of, in the ancient world, they would sometimes do etymologies that didn't always maybe don't really stand up to like modern linguistic scrutiny, let's say, but they would do them to make a sort of didactic point. There's one of those that is quite controversial in the Orthodox world, so I don't want to set anybody off, but you know the one I'm thinking of.
Is that the whole oil mercy thing?
Yeah.
It's nonsense, people. Just
people get really exercised about that one. But all right, so the Achilles, one of the etymologies for Achilles' name means something like the one without lips. So you've got the alpha privative and then the word for lips. Yeah. So the question is, does Achilles not have lips? Well, no, that seems unlikely. So it certainly would make the art of the Iliad a lot more terrifying. So if it's, can you imagine?
Thank you for asking me if I can imagine, because now I'm trying to imagine.
I'm really, really sorry.
Lipless
yeah,
warrior.
Not fun to think about.
Lipless one.
Yes. So this is, so does it mean he doesn't have lips, or does it mean something else? And so what the etymology that people kind of worked out in the ancient world is that it was a reference to the fact that he had never sucked at his mother's breast.
Okay.
And that this was because when he was born fully grown. And this is something that the pagan world had kind of worked out already, and it sort of makes sense of the timeline of the Trojan War and all this stuff.
Okay. So, all right, as I'm being introduced to this idea, there's a couple things, a couple hooks that I'm going to hang it on now. One is, okay, so that makes him like Adam, but also like it's definitely the whole fortune and glory thing. Mm-hmm. Like he lives fast and dies with a massive blaze of glory. So that means that Achilles' real life is just a few years long.
Right.
Really?
Now, you can extend some of these, 20 years long, depending on how long you think the Trojan War went or something like that. But even so, like that, it's like 10 years to get there, and then 10 years before the walls of Troy, and then 10 years to get home. How much time is, we shouldn't, I will just say this is a story from the Bronze Age. We should not get overly exercised about like how old is Achilles at the end of the war or something like that.
Yeah.
But it is something people notice in the ancient world. And, like how could he be a contemporary of Paris if Paris is a full-grown man with a reputation for, the ladies, and, at the wedding of Achilles' parents when he hasn't even been conceived yet. That's the idea.
Right.
So he's born. So there's this idea that is that Achilles is born fully grown. And what is further, and this is one of the things that is referenced in Christian literature about Achilles, is that the tradition about the death of Achilles is that he is shot in the foot with an arrow that was poisoned with the poison of a serpent.
Hmm. Hmm.
So he's this man who's like sort of born fully grown. He dies poisoned by a serpent, and there is a little bit of, he's gonna heal kind of a thing going on there as well, and
Yeah.
so there are all these sort of different shades and there is a female figure in the life of Achilles which does not come up in the Iliad, who is also was seen as an allegory of Eve, just by the way,
Hmm.
because it's sort of like his dalliance with her that gets him shot in the heel to begin with, and all this other stuff. So, long story short, um, early Christians understood the Iliad as being basically this pagan retelling of the fall of man. Achilles is a type of Adam, and that he sort of like falls and loses his humanity, right? And then we see the role of basically ritual, of the role of religion coming in to basically restore his relationship to the gods, right? Which means giving these proper funerary rites to Hector's corpse and so on, right?
Yeah.
The story is also very deeply concerned, and I will just say, by the way, there are other ways that Christians allegorically read the Iliad, which I cannot get into today, not only because we don't have time, but
Yeah.
it would just take a whole lot more effort to set them up.
Yeah.
So in the what was it, 11th century, I think, 12th century, there was a Bavarian princess named Bertha von Sulzbach
Wow.
who arrived in Constantinople to marry the emperor Manuel Komnenos.
Okay.
Now, Princess Bertha becomes the Empress Irene,
Oh,
but
I
when
did
she
not know
arrives,
her name was
she knows
Bertha.
nothing about the culture of the Christian East. And so a chronicler by the name of Ioannis Tzitzis, probably saying his name wrong, Tzitzis, uh, is commissioned to compose a summary of the Iliad and the Odyssey to introduce her to it, because they say, oh, you don't know anything about the culture of the Christian East. We have to start with Homer. And so he
Wow.
composes this 2-volume set of basically an allegorical retelling of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And he retells it on 3 different allegorical levels. One of so there's the first one, and it's the one that would make the least sense to modern readers. Well, there's the euhemerized version, so like all the gods are actually ancient kings, which we'll talk about in our next episode.
Yeah.
But the
Or
second version is the second allegory, second level of allegory, is what is sometimes called the astrological or the alchemical allegory.
hmm.
And both of those names are misleading. What it really is it's basically the way that the Iliad is an allegory for the creation of the world. And so different gods stand in for different elements, and you have like heat and air and vapors and humors and all this different stuff. It'd be very difficult to explain that to modern people, let alone to explain why it would be interesting or an important way to read the Iliad. But as I'm going to try to argue at the end here, the Iliad is this microcosm of the world, in the same way that Achilles is like this microcosm of Adam or of humankind. And then there was also a level of moral allegory in which you could see Aphrodite as desire, and Athena as wisdom, and so on, and Zeus as destiny, and
Yeah.
all that. So
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
that to say, the story is really deeply concerned with questions which seem to have troubled us since the beginning of time, such as, what is the relationship between fate and free will actually?
Oh,
Now, at this point,
absolutely.
Calvin has not come along and clarified this for people.
How can you say that with a straight face?
I know. Well, it's because I have a very dry sense of humor.
Okay. Well, all right. Well,
yeah.
I have to say, okay, I have to say,
Yeah.
because this is live, we are now at 97 minutes.
Awesome.
And so I think that what we're going to do, because we have a lot more to say in this introduction to the Iliad.
Yes.
I'm going to call an audible.
Okay.
And we're going to check in with the chat, and we're going to make
Okay.
the rest of this a part 2. We're going to make this a 2-part episode. Okay. So I'm
That's
calling
great.
a little bit of an audible here. So yeah, there's been a lot of fun stuff going on in the chat.
We could just do every episode 4 hours long, Father. Like,
I know. Well, I mean, you and I could, right? But there are other people, as we know. A shout out, of course, to our wonderful Matiska Tootie the Tank Richter, and Simon the Cyclops Nelson. That's what I've just decided,
Nice.
since he has to do with cameras and such. with a single I. That's what we're
Why
going to
do
call
they
him
get
from now
so
on.
many cool nicknames, and I get all of the horrible abuse that Father, not going to mention his name, piles upon me from episode to episode
What
of
can,
Lord of Spirits.
what can I say?
By the way, I just have to publicly call him out here and say that every time he does that, I get about 100 text messages from people like, "Oh, he just called you out on Lord of Spirit." Anyway, no, it's okay. I'm just
Don't say his name. He'll appear suddenly.
Yeah.
So, okay, a few things. All right, so Brianna asks about a list of texts that we quoted or recommended. She can't keep track. The big one I think you should walk away with is the Robert Fagel's translation.
Yeah, read the primary sources first. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. That's the big thing I think that everybody should walk away with. It's just good. It's a good for a lot of stuff. Haig mentions that book 2 of the Iliad is a bit of a slog.
Okay, I have so much to say. It's one of my favorite books of the Iliad, guys. It's
a big list. It's like everybody that showed up to the party.
It's usually called the catalog of ships, and I will just say this about it. Okay, usually people, they skip over it. It's a bunch of genealogies, and here's how many men and things like this. But if you look at the way that and I could prove this to you if I had time. But if you look at the numbers of the important cities, so when people come from, for instance, Lower Thebes, well, I should say, oh boy. Okay, so there's a prequel to the epic cycle, you guys, and it's called the Thebaid. It is the story of the 7 against Thebes, which is another important part of the early Bronze Age collapse saga,
and also a play we're going to discuss at some point.
Yes, it is a play. There's a great Latin retelling called the Thebaid, written by Statius. There's a ton of there's a ton of stuff to say about it, but actually the Thebaid by Statius is rad as heck, you guys. It's so fun. But okay, so anyway, there's a prequel to this, and so basically, as a result of the events of that, in the Bronze Age collapse, like Upper Thebes is destroyed, so there's just Lower Thebes, and so you can basically look at, here's all important cities, and see that those are all important, that are represented in the catalog of ships, and see those are all important cities that are later on they're destroyed. And next episode I will tell you why they're destroyed sometime after the Trojan War. But basically we can use the catalog of ships. People used to think it was meaningless, but it actually very accurately gives us an extremely accurate picture of the political situation before the Bronze Age collapse in the Aegean. So anyway, it's one of my favorite parts, and it's but I get why it's a slog, but it is awesome.
So Sam mentions, besides making a couple of now I'm blanking on the name of the game. Goodness. Yes, Elder Scrolls
Skyrim,
Skyrim is the best one.
Morrowind. Hey, listen,
Skyrim.
If you ever want to start the Elder Scrolls podcast, I'm there for it. By the way,
don't tempt me with another podcast. Is this number 9 for me? I think it is number 9 actually. Besides, he mentions that also. He gives a good summary for Russian fiction. He says, Russian novel in a single sentence: my liver hurts, and one day I will die.
Yeah, that seems right.
Seems pretty fair. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. I love the all the action going on in the chat. It's great to hear from all of you. We have so much more to talk about for this introductory episode that like I said, we're just going to have to cut it into 2, and we'll just do it next time. We'll just do it next time. We'll just do it next time. So this is the end here.
All right. Well, I have some closing thoughts on the Iliad, but maybe we'll just save them for next episode then.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Everyone, thanks for tuning in today to book 1 of our Iliad introduction. If you're edified by this conversation, please like, subscribe, share, and review. This show's home is on YouTube, but we're also out there on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and other places for people who think that, for instance, I have a good face for radio.
Yeah. And if you are watching on YouTube, make sure you click that little bell when you subscribe so that you get notified every time we put out a new episode when we go live. It's going to be twice a month, first and third Thursdays of the month. Next time we're going to do part 2 of this. After that, though, so I'm giving you a little bit of prognostication.
That's right.
We're going to do an introduction to the Prose Edda by Snorri Sturluson, which is one of the main sources of Norse mythology. But next time, Iliad intro, part 2.
Farewell, and may you always trace the silhouette of virtue in everything that you read.
This has been a listener and viewer supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.